Welcome to this final WEConversations of 2024, and thank you everyone for joining here in December. I know many busy schedules to finalize the year, and people are getting tired of joining meetings, but really happy to have you here. We started the year out looking at the year ahead with elections, and now we're completing the year of elections. And now I'm going to kind of try to digest some of that and look at what happened and what it means from a geopolitical sense, from business sense, and how that will affect the industry. So not to hesitate any further, welcome our guest, John Rega, to the conversation. John, very honest from me, an old friend here in Brussels, a longtime journalist in business and finance, and now is an advisor with CREAB Worldwide here in Brussels. So he's joining to provide us with that overview. And following John, I'm going to bounce around a little bit with some of our members who have joined just to hear from your own personal experiences and how your elections this year have affected you and what you think it means for you moving forward. So not going to speak any further. You'd be tired of me. So I hand it over to John. John.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, Andrew. Yeah, I really appreciate you introducing me to so many of your members, and so thanks also to the World Employment Confederation. Personally, it's a nice honor because I have been on both sides. Actually, I've been a client, once getting help from an HR services firm doing some recruiting, and I've also been the product. As a recruit at different times in my career, including working as a temp for earlier in my career. It actually was a very positive experience. So yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, for the conversation today, I guess let's get into some of the recent elections implications for your business. Just before the politics, I suppose we can start with the economic cycle. This, just as a reminder, because I'm sure you already know all this very well, but the obvious indicator is looking at what the central banks have been doing, and particularly in the big Western economies, we're kind of in this change of mode where we've been going from like inflation fighting mode and with interest rates going up, and now shifting back toward rate cutting mode. It's kind of trying for this proverbial soft landing to try to anticipate a slowdown in the economy. So economic cycles always have a lot of different drivers, but in this case, admittedly, the political uncertainty has definitely been one of the drivers of the cycle. So that's why we're talking about elections. So I think, as I understand from you, Andrew, the last time you were all together, or one of your previous times, you spoke about European Parliament elections. So you've kind of already
took a look at that before them, and then had a chance to sort of digest the fallout from those elections. But of course, many other elections have happened, and other world events, as we're experiencing in the past few days, that create uncertainty and questions as well moving forward, especially with new governments coming in next year and governments that have taken over recently. So yeah, if you could maybe jump in there and wherever you want to start, John.
Yeah, well, so I mean, it's a continuing story, and we've all seen how there's been this kind of trend toward the right, politically speaking, in a lot of countries. But what that actually means for how some of these new governments will actually govern is still coming into focus. And that's why I think even if there's a clear political trend in the outcomes of elections, but the actual, the delivery of governing is still quite uncertain. And this is the sort of uncertainty that we're living with. So, besides Europe, I think we'll hear from a few of the other, members what's happening in their countries, and also India, the huge, one of the most important elections in the world recently, still digesting. I think we'll talk about that as well. But I guess just one of the more recent ones, that has been a focus has been the United States, the biggest economy, and you can probably guess from my accent, it is my home country, even though I've lived in Brussels for some time. But whenever I have to explain the U.S., I always fall back on an old joke from Ronald Reagan. He used to say, the 8 scariest words in the English language: I come from Washington and I'm here to help. So So let's see if this is helpful at all to try to explain a little bit about what we're expecting out of the new government. So you may have heard Donald Trump was elected back to the presidency. He takes office 40 days from now. And, I would say in the very divided American politics, you wouldn't say that Trump won, a real massive landslide sort of election, but it was a very clear outcome and not disputed. And so, immediately afterward, we saw, a little bump in the market, basically signaling, a positive reaction from the business community that, or at least we've avoided, an unclear or disputed outcome. That's actually, that's also helped a lot of other leaders around the world, accept the outcome and start to shift their mindset toward dealing with the new administration in Washington. But what will they do? So the most obvious immediate expectation is a big change in trade policy, specifically imposition of tariffs. For Trump, since he tried to get into politics, it's been the issue that really set him apart from the rest of the pack. So, regardless of whatever one thinks about like his personal style or however he governed in his previous administration, that's the trade policy is kind of like his, one of his major animating things. And so we definitely expect some movement there. He's already made a kind of a verbal threat. I would describe it as kind of a warning shot to, some of the most important trading partners, Canada and Mexico, the U.S. two largest trading partners, which actually have a trade deal that he negotiated in his previous time as president. And he's also had a similar warning shot against, to China to say, as soon as he comes in office, he wants to impose some unilateral tariffs as a kind of a punitive measure related to things other than really trade policy. His first warning shots were really pointing toward things like, wanting more cooperation on cracking down on the drug trade or the, trade in drug precursors, or else, specifically around immigration and, cooperation in closing off pathways for people trying to, come into the U.S. in a, irregular way, just, coming over the border. So this is one of the first, major pronouncements he made after being elected. And so I think people, they take this as kind of a sort of an opening gambit, a kind of a way to signal the start of negotiations around some of these issues, around things like, drug trade or immigration pathways. So it's not taken as necessarily a firm promise that he will impose exactly the tariffs that he mentioned, but it is, it is a clear signal that this is that tariffs and trade policy are a tool that he intends to use. And I would say that if you fired a first warning shot, it does show that you do have ammunition and you are willing to use it.
John, just a quick question about that.
Yeah.
Should the US government impose those tariffs and you see retaliatory actions elsewhere, how's that going? What's the ripple effect on trade and investment and finally on jobs?
Yeah. So, well, if we do have a scenario of some tariffs, and I do expect we'll have some, then, there will be reactions for sure. Here where I'm sitting in Brussels, there's a lot of talk about how, there's already a working group inside the European Commission, inside the executive body that's preparing for countermeasures. We've heard the same from, the other national capitals. And so, the ripple effects could be, in a kind of an immediate, quick tapping of the brake on the economy. I've seen forecasts of, anything from, a few percentage points of loss of GDP in Europe specifically, if there was something as extreme as a 20% across the board tariff, like we've heard some people in the Trump camp suggest. Whether it's that substantial a reaction, it's hard to take any forecasts. Well, I would take any forecast with a grain of salt as far as the numbers, but generally speaking, the risks are to the downside, as the economists say. And in Europe, we're already looking at, the forecast for the next year is pretty close to zero growth. And then actually, you talked about ripple effects, Andrew. There's also the question of China, which is the thing that really animates in some ways, I think, Trump's trade policy. He's very concerned about, trade imbalance, especially in the goods trade with China, because that's been a hot political issue in the US. Even before we had an outcome in November, I've been saying that free trade was not on the ballot. There's not really a political constituency at this point for, continuing as we have been. And so if we do expect some kind of protectionist stance towards China, well, what does China do? They have a huge manufacturing base. They won't just turn that off. We could be speaking about diversion of trade toward Europe, which is, another big consumer market for China. So this just adds to the pressure, on Europe to use, even more of its countermeasures.
Just looking at Europe quickly, because we've looked at Europe previously in the year, but when you mentioned that, do you think that the unity currently exists here in order to react to these changes? And we're going to speak with colleagues from France, and that's a big question mark. And our colleague from Germany had to step off, but they have big elections coming up as well. So just wondering how that uncertainty plays into this. And we'll hear from the UK. We're still including UK in the European project, but just the response to this and what's possible. But do you think there can be unity in Europe as a response to what the US does, what China does? And we haven't even gotten to some of the conflicts going on in the world that can upend many of this as well.
Yeah, for sure. There will be a lot of pressure around Europe to try to, divide countries, because they do have very different trade policies and very different, policies toward China, and also to some degree, policies, toward the US, not as much in the trade area, but in terms of, security and defense. It's been, it was one of the tactics that President Trump used, between 4 and 8 years ago, last time he was in office, to try to look toward the capitals of the bigger member states as his sort of counterparts, his negotiating partners, as it were, instead of Brussels. But for at least the EU countries, the EU is the union itself is where a lot of the legal authority lies for trade policy. It's where the instruments are. And so we've seen in some cases in the past when, for example, there was a dispute between China and Lithuania, one of the member states that's not usually the focus of trade policy. We did see, unity within the EU in trying to make sure that, they spoke with one voice and that they were able to, put up a united front. But of course, the fact that, we do have a German election coming up, we have a huge, political uncertainty in France, that just, those are two main, important drivers against European unity, because a lot of the times when there are policy challenges for Europe, what the EU does is looks to Germany and France to try to come together and set a general direction. They call it the Franco-German engine, and right now no one is at the wheel.
Do you see anyone else, just from the European perspective, we'll move on to other parts of the world, do you see any other countries in Europe willing to jump behind the wheel at this point?
Well, I think they'll have to. I think watching what the UK does will be hugely important. I think we'll hear more about that. I can say from Brussels, where I'm sitting, where Andrew, you're sitting as well, the spirit of cooperation is much better, and we'll see this play out in security and defense. I can well imagine. The new British government has already made efforts to try, a reset with of relations with the rest of Europe. And so, that is a positive pressure.
So we spent time already talking about the US and touched on China, but we haven't gone over to India yet. Maybe if you could share some thoughts, another big election there. Now, leadership remains the same, but there was some change there in the makeup of Modi's government, and just wondering what will that have any effect moving forward? And obviously, India is still such a major player and growing, and how they may play a real big factor in what's the moving pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, definitely a big factor. People, in everywhere in the West are watching very closely what the new sort of Modi coalition government can do. I think we see, for starters, on the geopolitics, we've seen a kind of an easing of tensions, Delhi to Beijing. So this is seen, I think, around people I've spoken to around Europe as, China wanting, India wanting to maintain itself as kind of as in a way, as a kind of an independent actor, not necessarily, as a counterweight to China, but it sees itself as someone who can do business with both sides. And I think that will remain a really important role, especially considering that Modi has remained open to Russia, and right now most of Western Europe is has been looking at relations with India through the lens of the war in Ukraine. And so, with India as a major buyer of oil and gas from Russia, that's been a real strain on tensions. So, meanwhile, of course, a lot of European countries are customers of India for refined fuels. So it's a complicated relationship, but the fact that India is playing this kind of geopolitical sort of balancing act, it makes it really important.
Just looking over to South America, because there's a trade deal pending, I would say, with Europe especially.
Yes.
Well, how do you see that playing a factor moving forward, and what that may mean for members in this group when they, looking for opportunities in that part of the world, many of whom have operations in South America, Latin America?
It seems like a positive development, certainly for South America, for not all of South America, but the Mercosur countries, which have a lot of them do have trade relationships with Europe, but I think it's widely seen as an area with a lot of growth potential, and those are faster growing economies. As far as getting approval of an agreement, I think politically for Europe it will be quite difficult because trade and agriculture is controversial, and we see already that the farmers have already been out protesting in Brussels about this. It's an important political constituency, especially in a lot of countries, but France in particular, at a time when we've had a government collapse. It will make it it's, I think, a very uncertain outcome as far as getting Europe's approval on this deal that's at least been signed.
You and I had gone back and forth on some messages, also just looking at the conflicts
Yeah.
ongoing right now, and a lot has changed in the past few days here. That it's going to affect countries' decisions, how they move forward, and how they react to that. How do you see? I mean, you don't have a crystal ball either, but how do you see those playing a big role in impacting economies and decisions moving forward when it comes to trade? Because countries are going to have to pivot and get involved in these situations, and it wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't part of necessarily of a future Trump administration to have to deal with Syria like this
Yeah.
and possibly spreading throughout the Middle East. Just wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit, John.
Yeah, elections happen in different ways, and sometimes it's it's been the processes that we anticipate and are on the calendar for years in advance, and then there are the known unknowns. I think Syria, after the terrible civil war there, has been in this category for a while, a little bit overshadowed, but the events of the last week remind a lot of people here about what was happening a decade ago when the outbreak of civil war was one of the major drivers of the refugee crisis in Europe, which actually, in some ways, was one of the motivating factors in the kind of rightward political trend that we've seen. I would say if there's another surge of refugees, very understandably trying to escape a war zone, then it will be, a huge source of political instability for Europe. Economically, it's hard to say, what it means. Syria has not been, like a major trading partner, but it's been, it's just a sign that sort of the geopolitics remains, it remains always a source of, chaos and uncertainty, and something that leaders will have to deal with.
John, before I open it and move to Kate, and we're going to take questions from everyone a little later, I do have a question from our Global Vice President, Bart Van Kempen of Manpower. And just, he's looking, the optimist in the room is Bart. And he's just wondering, John, if you see a scenario where there is economic growth, especially for Europe, do you see some positives here buried beneath the surface, or is it somewhat gloomy?
Well, I mean, all the balance of risks, as the economists would say, point toward the downside, because we don't know what we'll get in terms of all of the follow-through actions if there is to be, say, a major trade war, which is economically is not good for anyone. But there are some upside risks, because if there is, if there is productive negotiations, say with the next Trump administration, if people understand, I think, how to work with him a little bit better than when he came into office 8 years ago. We saw that actually even before he's taken office. We saw when the leaders of Mexico and Canada had moved immediately to engage with Trump to try to get ahead of some of this kind of bombastic warning shot style negotiating. And so maybe people will maybe we'll be able to have a more negotiated approach to some of the scenarios, especially around trade and tariffs. And so it's not that it's necessarily a source of, an unexpected source of growth, but just avoiding some of the negative scenarios already, frankly, priced into the market a little bit. So maybe, yeah, if things go a little bit better than the gloomy expectations, that maybe we do have more than the 0 point something% growth that we expect in Europe in the next year. Globally, I think it's the forecast is something like 3%, which is actually pretty low historically. So maybe if there is avoiding some of the worst case scenario, then maybe we do find some upside.
Okay, Bart, I hope we didn't crush your optimism. I hope that works for you. John, thank you so much. I'm going to leave you there for now. So we'll bounce around a little bit here and we'll come back with questions. So if you have questions for John, please throw them in the chat, or when I come back to a Q&A, please just jump in, put your hand up, and we'll get to you. But I want to make sure that I do get around here a little bit. We have members who had big elections in their countries this year. And I want to start with Kate Shoesmith from the REC in the UK. And Kate, I'm going to add you in a spotlight here. And please go ahead. Just wondering from you, Kate, you had a huge election that brought in a big change after over a decade of one governing party. Just wondering now, is the dust is settled on your election, how things look? What's the outlook for next year and right now, and especially these big changes that John's talked about around the world, how this government has reacted, and are they prepared to take this on?
Thank you, Andrew. And yeah, I'm really pleased to talk about this. It appeals to the geeky side of my character. Is like, I think there's a number of us here who like watching the politics quite closely. The first thing that struck me when John was speaking is how contrary the UK can be. So as the rest of the world shifts to the right, what happens in the UK is we elect a left-leaning government. But you're completely correct, is it's followed 14 years of Conservative and coalition government, which was right-leaning. So it was sort of the expected outcome and the natural reaction after that, because it is that rebalancing. It tends to be the way in British politics that there is that rebalancing moving from, and remember, this is very much left of centre. It's rather, and just like we could say that the Conservative government was right of centre. What it does, though, is it does a few things. Well, first of all, we knew the election was coming. The advantage of having fixed term Parliament Acts means that you can predict with pretty good certainty the sort of time of year of an election. And the only thing that was good about our election in the UK perspective was that it was called earlier than it could have been. So we could still be waiting right now for a general election, because the latest it could have happened was January 2025. And many commentators, particularly economists, would say that the good thing was the election was called early, because the impact on the market is always really clear. So what happens, and it doesn't make a lot of sense on a pragmatic level, is that when you look at our services-based economy, and the recruitment and professional services being very much part of that service-based economy, is people held on to their jobs and stopped hiring for a while, just reflecting the fact that an election was coming. So we've now seen that permanent hiring in the UK has been relatively flat. It's held up in certain sectors really, really well, where we know we've got high demand and particular skill sets that need to be recruited for. As you'd expect in the run up to Christmas, those roles that are intrinsic to Christmas hiring, so hospitality, retail, logistics, all of those, they've been doing well in terms of a temporary and contract workforce as well, but very much seasonally driven. But in the run up to an election, people paused and they held on to those roles. And so the good news of having an election slightly earlier than expected, most of the guesses were that it would be an autumn 2024 election. Instead, we had a summer one, was that it unleashed it a bit. The other thing with having a complete change after 14 years is you have a new government with a very clear mandate. So they've, they had a number of manifesto commitments that relate quite clearly to employment regulations and the way that people will hire and both recruit and retain their workforces. Is that means that they've got that mandate to go ahead and press ahead, plus they've got a big majority in Parliament. So the likelihood is most of those regulatory changes will go through. So from our perspective, when we talk to our 3,000 plus UK recruitment business members, it's not overstating it to say that what we're about to see in terms of employment regulations in the UK will be the biggest change in a generation. There'll be a lot of change there. Some of these things are entirely as we expected. There's a lot of detail. Some of these things will take a long time to work through. So whilst the government's elected this year and are pushing ahead very quickly with what they want to do, most of it won't be enacted into law until the middle of 2026 at the absolute earliest. So that gives us quite a bit of stability. So to Bart's question about growth, that's the mandate, that's the mission. But it does look relatively flat because we have so many of these concerns ongoing about what will that regulatory environment will look like, how will it work in practice. So the best projections now are for around about a 1% growth next year, if we're lucky, in the UK economy. But considering where we've been over the last couple of years, we'll take that. That's pretty good comparatively. And then I just thought the last thing I'll say before we move on, because I know you've lots of people to talk to and really interesting perspectives to gain, is you're completely right, John, about the nature of this UK government and how it wants to work with the rest of the world. So the charm offensive, the phrase that we use for ourselves when we're going out and talking to the European Parliament, that's absolutely the approach of the UK government right now. Sending our Chancellor of the Exchequer, so the person in charge of the Treasury, to Brussels just yesterday. Really clear that they want to have that good engagement. It's no accident that they sent Prince William to meet with Trump at the weekend in Paris. Those things are all part of this charm offensive about how do you engage with the rest of the world, knowing the economies of the rest of the world are quite interlinked, that trading conditions are difficult, definitely trying to get on a different footing in terms of working with Europe. And actually, one of the first things that our brand new Foreign Secretary did straight after the July election was meet with China in London. So there really is that sense of how do we foster that global enterprise alliances more in a more considered way, at the same time trying to unpick what's gone before is very difficult, and there is a lot to consider. And my last thing on that is I think that some of those the wars in other parts of the world, particularly if we think about Ukraine, think about what's happening in the Middle East, the need to foster those engagements and to work more closely and collaboratively with your Western allies, I think it's come to the fore. It's made people really think about that, and the impact that does then have on trade.
Kate, before I move on to Cone, I really wanted to ask you a question because you mentioned that charm offensive that the UK government's making. But when I was at your conference, it was in June, before the election, it wasn't a big secret what was going to happen in that election. And your team had spent months making those connections and relationships with the incoming government. Just wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit and all that work that went into placing you with them, so you could basically start running right off the start, and how you prepared your members for all these changes, like you've already talked about a little bit.
Yeah, it was a huge part of our work, and you're absolutely right. The work for that. So we didn't know when an election would be called, but we knew it would be at some point during 2024. So that's good because it gives you that clear lead time. And it becomes very clear that when you've had a consistency of one party in government, that there's going to be that change and that transfer of power. Because as a country, people just go, right, it's time for a change. And you have to think of everything that the previous governments had gone through and overseen, whether it's these things really matter. A Scottish independence referendum, an EU referendum, which led to Brexit, COVID, geopolitical events. There's so much happening. So you knew that there was going to be a change. Our first tack was to really understand who were the power players in the Labour Party, and to understand what it is that would be their central ideology, how they viewed the broader HR services and recruitment industries, what would be the things that they would be looking to change or develop on, and what did we need to do to educate them in their thinking around that. So mapping out those stakeholders, understanding where sometimes you know who the headline actors are. So, it's very obvious that we're going to have a Keir Starmer as a prime minister and a deputy prime minister as Angela Rayner. All the figures, we know those. But who are their special advisors? Who are the people that they're relying on and talking to? And in our context, what are the think tanks that they're commissioning? Because they have very small pools of people actually within the Labour Party. When you're not in government, they don't have much resources. Who are they commissioning as external political advisors and influencers? And what type of thinking do we need to be providing them with? So mapping all of that out, getting to know some of those stakeholders. And what became really, really clear to us is that we needed to be on the front foot in terms of explaining the temporary agency market in particular, and not why, economically speaking, that's important for the UK economy, or what it contributes in terms of GDP, or the type of work it does in terms of serving clients and candidates. We needed to explain the motivations of the agency workers themselves. That's what became really clear, is because we were encountering different special advisors to now the government, whose experience of temporary work was quite out of kilter with the modern perspectives and what happens today. So that was the basis of a big campaign that we've run throughout the rest of 2024, really explaining why temporary workers work the way they do, and that's been the key driver for us.
Thanks so much for reflecting on that. It's really interested me throughout this process to see how you prepared for that. So thanks. You might not have been prepared for that question, but thanks so much for sharing that. So okay, we're going to move on to Cone, and
put your own mic out, Andrew, so we can't hear you now.
Pardon me, I muted myself in there, and I'm trying to change your spotlight. I'm multitasking is terrible right now. Your elections came a little bit earlier in the Netherlands, but it was a surprise for you, I think. And maybe you'll put us set us straight. Maybe they weren't such a surprise, but a big change in direction there that came together this year with the forming of government. And just if you could reflect a little bit on that change and what it means for the staffing industry that has met many challenges recently, and you're looking to getting reforms through, and now with a new group to make that happen with. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Koen Vogel. I'm a policy advisor on labor migration at the ABU, and today's substitute speaker. In the Netherlands, we tend to do follow, unlike UK, America. So we kind of elected our own Trump in the name of Geert Wilders and his far-right party, the PVV, which is the Party for Freedom. They won the election, and it has some big implications for our sector, mainly in the field of migration. This new government has set a clear mission to implement the strictest migration policy in Dutch history. This mainly includes measures to limit the amount of refugees requesting asylum in the Netherlands, but also on labor migration, which is concerning for a country heavily reliant on international laborers to address labor shortage in critical sectors in the Netherlands. While we understand the political pressures behind this stance, it risks undermining economic growth and the flexibility needed in our labor market. There's an increasing political pressure to restrict temporary staffing to narrowly defined scenarios, such as covering peaks in demand or replacing workers on sick leave. We call it piek en ziek in the Netherlands. This push comes despite the agreement we made with the Dutch unions, where we were collectively committed to reducing excessive use of temporary contracts. These agreements are already being translated into legislation aiming to provide a balanced framework for flexibility and stability in the labor market. However, the political discourse has shifted towards a more rigid emphasis on permanent contracts at client companies. So the private employment sector has taken significant steps to accelerate access to permanent contracts directly through agencies, but these efforts seem to be overlooked by the political wish for permanent contracts at client companies, unfortunately. In addition to these challenges, the Minister of Social Affairs and Employment announced the possibility of sectoral ban on staffing in the meat industry. So only in the meat industry for now. The ministry is currently exploring this option, particularly in response to the ongoing abuses in the meat sector. While ABU is actively participating in a task force to address these issues in the meat sector, we firmly believe that a blanket ban on staffing in a specific sector will not solve the root causes of exploitation. We are for structural enforcement of fair labor practices and higher industry standards. Those will be way more effective solutions, in our opinions. There are some additional threats to the staffing agencies with this government. Several other restrictions are looming at the moment. They're investigating the possibilities of a maximum assignment duration. These new rules could limit the length of a time a temporary worker can be assigned to one and the same client. In addition to that, in a recent letter, the ministry announced that the exclusion of our sector from the expat program. So only pre-selected companies in the Netherlands are allowed to be employers for expat. And in this new ruling, this letter indicates that those companies will no longer be allowed to engage in staffing practices. So this essentially means that our sector will no longer be allowed to engage in posting expats, with a few exceptions, but I won't get into that. It's a bit too complicated for now. Last but not least, the talent pool. This EU initiative should make it more attractive for the EU to have third country talent to come to the EU. The Dutch government is likely to choose the option to exclude private employment agencies from being recognized as employers within this initiative, which could further marginalize our role in international recruitment. And this is the common thread in all the new and the coming regulation. Possible new migration paths or migration paths that are already open do not stand a chance and are immediately shut down by our new government. These regulatory challenges come at a time when the staffing industry is already under strain. Total hours worked and revenue in our sector have been declining for some time now. And at the same time, a wave of new legislation demands a greater compliance efforts of court, and increasing costs for agencies are already operating in a shrinking market. So in summary, the staffing industry in the Netherlands is facing some significant challenges. However, as ABI, we are committed to working collaboratively with stakeholders to find balanced solutions that protect workers' rights while preserving the essential role the staffing agencies are playing still in our labor market. And due to the changing landscape, the ABU is in the middle of a strategy process to end it on kind of a positive note. So we're trying to reposition ourselves in the market and to hope to future-proof our industry, kind of. So not too positive, but that's the situation for now.
Thanks for that. What kind of workarounds can you do with this new government? Like, what kind of allies can you partner up with other stakeholders to maybe force their hand on some of these issues? I know the talent pool, for those of you who don't know, is a European initiative to open the doors to talent from third country nationals. And the Netherlands currently has a government that is very anti-immigration. So just wondering, are there any workarounds there, or is it just going to take determined lobbying and pushback on your part?
Well, as our government is so much more right than the people working for the government are, we see that the people working for the government are still not in line with what they actually say. So there's a lot of politics for the outside, but on the inside, there's still a lot of people who do tend to agree with us. So yeah, the people inside the government are still on our side, is my feeling.
So hail the bureaucracy, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for this, Koen. I know it's not the most positive situation, but I think it's really important that people understand your situation. Many of these challenges existed before this government, but now you have many roadblocks in the way, but
Sure.
very important that the membership knows. So thanks for this. And we'll leave it for questions for Koen as well, but if you have them, please throw them in the chat. I'm going to move on to France. So we're taking the high-speed train south a little bit to Mathilde Bonichon, and to hopefully hear about your perspective on what's going on. It's adventurous, for sure. Maybe not the word that you'd be looking to describe what's happening currently in France, but I think really important for everyone to have an idea of what is happening there. Please.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Yes, probably to give you the context after the European election in France, the President Emmanuel Macron decided to dissolve the lower chamber of the Parliament, Assemblée Nationale. And the result of the election is a big challenge for now in France, because it creates a division in the political sphere. There is no more majority at the parliament. So the first party is a far right, even if there were a coalition between far left, communist and socialist at the lower chamber. And that's the reason why for the budget they decided not to follow the prime minister, and the prime minister resigned this week, and now we are waiting for a new prime minister in France. So it's very difficult, because if the president nominate somebody from the left, the far right will not approve any question of the budget at the parliament. So it creates another resignation of the prime minister. And on the contrary, if it choose somebody on the right side, the left wing will not follow the prime minister, so it change another time the prime minister. So we are waiting for the nomination of the prime minister, but it should be somebody from the center. and the big challenge is that to have this coalition between center left and center right, because there are political discussion in the perspective of the presidential election in 27. So nobody wants to give any advantage for the left or for the right. So for the time being, it's very challenging in France. And on the temporary work activity, it's not good because we are losing more than 4,000 full-time equivalent for the last year. So it's not a good time for temporary work. And the fact that there is no stability at the labor minister, it's not a good thing, because we have to convince every time for the new people in place and to advocate, to explain what is our industry. So it's not a good time for the time being in France.
How is President Poil looking at dealing with that? Because, I mean, if Macron stays, because he has more years on his mandate for now, you could be going through a cycle of elections every month, every couple of months here. How would you focus on dealing with such a turnover, parliamentary turnover?
We are wishing there is no new legislation on labor, so we try to stay stable at the regulation on temporary work, even if we had some bad news last month, because there was a new law that creating a competitor to temporary work, and now we try to resist to the changes and keep the stability on the regulation, but it's quite difficult.
So for you, it doesn't really matter whether this government leans left or right. It's about stability. That's the most important aspect now.
Yes, we try to stay at the same level of regulation, not more regulation on temporary work, even if we have a lot in France. And yeah, the big challenge now is the economic growth that is not good, and some economics are saying that the French economy is going on recession. So wait and see.
Okay, well, not the most positive outlook, but that is what's happening right now, and I think it's really important that members hear what you're dealing with, what the Netherlands is dealing with. John, back to you. I mean, you've talked about economic growth probably really isn't in the forecast as much, but if you were to look at one region in particular or country where you may see positive change moving forward, would you be able to point one out beyond Europe, globally?
Yeah, I would say, it's probably the faster growing, economies, and maybe, I don't, let's see, if I just have a peek at a cheat sheet I have of some economic forecasts. I think, we depended for many years on growth in China as being an overall engine, and we don't have that now. So where do you look? And, within Europe's, there's still, I think, potential in the East. And then, otherwise, I would say, still a lot of growth expected in some of the other countries in Asia. So looking to the East. Yeah. So that's not necessarily a brand new story, but that is the scenario.
When you look at the BRICS group, which seems to be growing every day, it's that acronym's not going to do them much good much longer. But do you see that bloc gaining in strength moving forward, or are they kind of not running on fumes but doing much what everyone else is doing right now?
Well, you see, what's driving it is this idea of people trying to, find a different path between, not just being kind of, US or China centric, and to try to find another configuration. Whether the BRICS group itself is something that, holds together and can weather, especially, how the rest of the world is how a lot of, sorry, I shouldn't speak for the rest of the world, but how Russia's neighbors to the west are viewing their foreign policy, whether the group can actually stick together despite all that. Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. And I'm not sure though the other countries are really thinking about that as a necessarily a long-term home for them. But the idea that they want to have a home that's not simply orbiting the US or orbiting China or being stuck bouncing back and forth between the two, that is a genuine desire.
Well, listen, I want to open up the floor. We only have 6 minutes left, so I want to open the floor to questions if you have questions. But I'd like to put a question out to everyone online with our members. Just wondering from you, we've heard a little bit from some, but when you look around the world at other economies, other countries, what they've gone through, where are you looking for examples or opportunities? Just curious about that. And some of your business tentacles don't reach everywhere, but if you take a look at certain situations, go, you know what, we're going to pursue that. This might be a bit more for the corporate. So I don't know if Bart or Pam can come on, but just curious from any of the members here if you see kind of a shining star around the world. Kate, I'm looking at you. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but very UK based, obviously. But when you look around and go, okay, that's a positive, and we'll take something from that. Is there anywhere you see?
So I'm happy to kick off. Actually, really interestingly, when we talk to our large corporates, UK based, and actually, I suppose the next tier down, so those UK run businesses that don't necessarily have an international presence, the things that they're looking at is if they've already established in the US, then they're going to push ahead there. If they're not, they're very, very cautious about not going now because of all the things, the too many unknowns. And so John's known unknowns is there's too many unknown unknowns with all of this for them to push that button right now. And then it's much more. I think you were talking about those growing establishing economies. Traditionally, we'd always looked at our nearest neighbors, but now it's sector by sector. Where are you strong in, and where's the opportunity? And it could be much further afield than just Europe. So that's my starter on it.
Thanks, Kate. I'm going to pick on because he doesn't know this, but Michael, I'm going to use Michael, my colleague, our resident German, because our German colleagues had to step off. Michael, if you, in 2-3 minutes, just maybe could you explain a little bit about what's coming up, elections in Germany, and you don't have to get into the nitty gritty of what it may mean, but maybe just to give people some highlights of what may come down the pipe.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, Germany saw a departure of the liberals from the coalition. They were kicked out of the coalition. And after quite some fights on budgets and other policies, and we are heading towards elections in the spring of next year. We are seeing, as in many other countries in Europe and worldwide, a polarization of far right and far left. What will happen most likely is a center-right coalition continuing to govern. Whether it's going to be led by CDU or led by SPD, it's too early to say. But most likely it's going to be a grand coalition, as we have seen in the past years before the current coalition. And for the industry, it means it depends a lot on who becomes chancellor, who becomes labor minister, so that's too early to say.
Just good to know, and thank you, Michael, for that, because as John mentioned, no one's at the wheel in France and Germany, so something we want to look out for to see if someone does take it. We have 3 minutes left, so let me just see if I have a question that's coming in here. Yes.
Hi, Andrew. Can you hear me? It's Pam. Sorry.
I can. Pam, please.
I apologize to my colleagues. I can't seem to get my camera to come on this morning, or I would for all of you. What I will say, just as a thought for all of us, is to keep our eye when it comes to a talent-centric focus, knowing that we've got labor market shortages. Keep our eye on those developing economies and economies like across LATAM that has talent, and especially our partners in South Africa and in Africa overall, from a talent perspective. John has done such a great job talking about all things US. Thank you, John, for that. But I think as we look at this through the lens of how do we help find the talent that our clients are looking for that end game, let's keep our eye on those markets as we are doing here at the WEC, all those labor regulations that can influence that. But those are the ones that are the most intriguing to me right now.
Thanks, Pam. And before we wrap up, Nadine, I really like your comment in the chat. I just want to invite you, if you have 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, maybe to share about that situation where you find yourself right now, where global conflict is very much in front of you, surrounding you, for that matter.
Yes, thank you so much. So currently we are operating in Egypt. USA, UE and KSA, we're kind of trapped in the Middle East political problems now. So the only country that we find potential with currently is China. And also in Egypt specifically, we're having like a changing phase because the parliament is discussing a new labor law. So we're still waiting for 2025 to see how things will be going. To be honest, we don't seem to find a growth rate in 2025, but at least things will keep as it is to see when the labor law is announced, we will see how things will operate and also how things will go politically in the region. So this is currently what things are going on.
Excellent. Nadine, thanks so much for jumping in there at the end. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We have probably 30 seconds left. John, thanks so much. Any final words, 30 seconds, or leave it to you? Are you good?
I'll just say, before I made just a joke about having been both client and product, I wanted to emphasize it was a very, very positive experience. And so I really was an honor to be able to speak with you today. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week. And like I said, this is recorded, so we'll be posting this. So if you would like to share it around and share with your colleagues who weren't able to join, that would be wonderful. Thanks again. Take care, everyone.